Justice Sonia Sotomayor leaned forward. Her voice, sharp and unyielding, cut through the quiet like a blade. "Congresswoman, that will be enough." In an instant, Jasmine Crockett's words were sliced off mid-sentence. She had been building momentum, her voice steady and resolute, her eyes locked on the audience of jurists and citizens alike. And then, just like that, the gavel of authority swung down not with wood and sound, but with interruption. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The courtroom froze. The air itself seemed suspended, caught between outrage and disbelief. The only sound was the echo of Sotomayor's command, ricocheting off the marble walls, a reminder of the immense weight of the bench she occupied. Crockett did not flinch. Her jaw tightened, her gaze steady. There was no outburst, no visible panic. Just a pause that burned hotter than any retort could have in that moment, because everyone in that room understood what had just happened. This was not just a procedural nudge. This was not a minor correction. A justice of the Supreme Court had tried to muzzle a rising voice. And not just any voice, but the voice of a congresswoman whose every word carried the sharp edge of lived truth, the fire of communities that refused to be silenced. The spectators shifted in their seats. Some averted their eyes, as though watching a storm too dangerous to stare at. Others leaned forward, hearts pounding, waiting to see what would happen next. It was the kind of moment that burned itself into memory, the hush before history. Justice tried to silence her. The whispers seemed to travel through the chamber. But what happened next froze the courtroom. Jasmine Crockett breathed in, slow and deliberate, her silence louder than the justice's command. Her reply had not yet come, but her presence was already speaking volumes. A spark glowed behind her calm, a spark that promised fire. And if Sotomayor thought that moment would end the exchange, she had no idea what storm was about to break. But if Sotomayor thought Jasmine Crockett would back down, the next few minutes would prove her dead wrong. What unfolded in that chamber was not just a procedural interruption. It was not just a judge reining in a speaker. It was a collision of forces far larger than one room, larger even than the marble weight of the Supreme Court itself. In that instant, the silence following Justice Sotomayor's interruption carried the full gravity of centuries of battles over who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and who has the authority to silence voices that dare to rise. Jasmine Crockett was not merely a congresswoman delivering remarks. She was carrying the resonance of generations who had struggled to claim their rightful place in America's story. She spoke with the cadence of those who had endured the indignities of being cut short, dismissed, underestimated, and told to wait their turn. Every word she managed to utter before that interruption bore the fingerprints of those silenced before her. To cut her off was to cut into that history, and Justice Sotomayor, seated high above, represented the very embodiment of institutional power. She had the robe, the gavel, the stature. She had the authority of a bench that seemed untouchable, and in that moment she leaned on it not with curiosity, not with openness, but with the cold hand of command. What might have been routine from another judge became something else here, something symbolic, arrogance cloaked in authority, the weight of an institution pressed against a single voice daring to challenge it. The stakes could not have been higher. This was not simply about decorum. It was not about the flow of argument. It was about whether truth could stand its ground against interruption, whether courage could stare down centuries of power, whether a lone figure could refuse to yield even when an entire institution loomed above. The audience inside the chamber felt it. The country, watching through cameras and live streams, felt it too, because the divide was clear. Here stood a woman representing lived struggle, challenging entrenched power, and across from her, a justice cloaked in robes of tradition, seemingly determined to remind her of her place. This wasn't just a clash of words. It was a clash over truth itself, truth that could not be dressed up in procedure or buried under the veneer of authority, truth that refused to wait politely for permission. And in that tension, the spark began to glow. The nation did not yet know it, but that spark would soon leap from courtroom marble to phone screens, from news segments to dinner tables, from whispers in the chamber to roars on social media. What felt like a sharp exchange in a single room was about to ignite a national conversation. Because when an institution tries to muzzle authenticity, the result is never silence. It is amplification. And Crockett's moment, born out of attempted silencing, was about to echo louder than anyone in that room could have imagined. The gavel of authority had struck. But the strike had not ended. The sound it had started the reverberation. And the spark that would ignite the nation was about to strike. Because to understand why this confrontation hit so hard, you need to know who was standing on that bench. For years, Justice Sonia Sotomayor had been cast in the American imagination as a symbol of triumph. Her rise from a Bronx upbringing to the heights of the Supreme Court was framed as proof that the system could elevate those once excluded from its corridors. To many, she was the embodiment of dignity, a woman of color on the nation's highest bench, wielding her intellect and heritage as part of the country's evolving story. But behind that carefully polished image, contradictions festered. The robe of authority has a way of hardening even the humblest of origins. With each gavel strike, Sotomayor became less the child of struggle and more the guardian of procedure. Her public speeches often carried lofty words about justice and equality. Yet inside the chamber she could be quick to dismiss voices that disrupted her vision of order. Observers had noticed it before. The sharpness of tone, the impatience with those who did not meet her standards of composure, the subtle but unmistakable policing of how arguments were framed, how voices were raised, how passion dared to enter spaces traditionally reserved for restraint. She had once been the outsider, yet now, seated high on the marble bench, she had become the enforcer of inside rules. It was a kind of arrogance cloaked in civility, a dismissiveness so refined that it could be mistaken for authority itself. A raised eyebrow, a clipped phrase, a firm hand that claimed to maintain order but too often stifled the inconvenient. These were not the gestures of a villain in a storybook sense. They were subtler, more insidious the small ways power enforces silence, while insisting it is merely upholding decorum. And so the irony grew heavier. The very justice sworn to uphold voices of truth would now try to silence one. It was not a scene out of character for her, but it was one laid bare in a way the public rarely sees. On this day, the cameras captured not the myth of Sonia Sotomayor, but the brittle reality of power when challenged. Because for all her stature, there was fragility beneath the robe. Authority can create the illusion of strength, but it can also reveal insecurity. What kind of strength interrupts a voice mid-sentence? What kind of confidence demands silence rather than engaging with words? To muzzle is to admit fear that truth, if allowed to echo, might resonate louder than command. This was not the dignity the nation had been promised in its story of her rise. This was the brittleness of someone who, when confronted with a voice unafraid, reached for the blunt tool of interruption rather than the scalpel of reasoning. And the contrast was almost theatrical. On one side, a justice cloaked in centuries of precedent, her authority unquestioned, her words carrying the weight of law. On the other, a congresswoman armed only with her voice, her conviction, and the unshakable knowledge that she was speaking not just for herself, but for millions who had never been granted the marble platform. That is what made this interruption so startling, so revealing. It was not simply an exercise of power. It was a moment when the mask slipped, when the brittle edge of arrogance cracked through the veneer of dignity. The world saw not a justice at ease with truth, but one unsettled by it, and the public watching this clash unfold recognized the symbolism immediately. Sotomayor was not merely silencing a congresswoman. She was enacting the timeless drama of institutions suppressing the voices that challenge them. It was a reminder that power, no matter how noble its origins, often forgets the very struggles that lifted it to prominence. In that sense, she was more than a justice. She became the villain of the drama, the figure who, draped in authority, sought to choke off authenticity. Not an evil caricature, but something more compelling. A complex antagonist whose power was real, whose contradictions were glaring, and whose fragility was about to be exposed. And therein lay the drama. The audience did not need a perfect villain, one painted in black and white. They needed a fallible figure, someone whose arrogance was relatable, whose brittleness reflected the weaknesses of every institution that has ever tried to silence a truth-teller. Sotomayor, in this clash, became that figure. But who exactly was the firebrand daring enough to stare her down? That's where the real story begins. Long before Jasmine Crockett stood in that courtroom, long before the cameras captured her defiance against authority, her story had already been forged in fire. She was not born into the halls of privilege. She did not inherit a seat at the table. Instead, she grew up knowing what it meant to fight for space, to claim a voice in a world that too often pretended not to hear. Her roots were humble, but her resolve was anything but. As a child, she learned quickly that the world was not always kind to those who looked like her, sounded like her, or carried the pride of identity that others tried to erase. She saw neighbors silenced in city halls, watched communities dismissed by those who claimed to represent them, and understood that injustice was not an abstraction. It was lived reality. From those early days, Crockett carried within her a kind of double vision. She could see the world as it was, in all its unfairness, and she could also see what it might become if people stood up instead of bowing down. That vision became her fuel. Education was not just a path out. It was a weapon she sharpened for the battles she knew would come. Law school followed not as a careerist's choice, but as a calling to stand for the unheard, to defend those too easily brushed aside. Her practice as a civil rights attorney was marked by cases where others might have looked away. She took on clients who had no chance without her, fought against systems that assumed victory by default. In those early courtrooms, Crockett learned something vital. Power respects only those who refuse to cower. Again and again, she stood across from prosecutors, officials, judges, and let her voice cut through, not with arrogance, but with clarity. That clarity was her gift. Where others shouted, she spoke with conviction. Where others faltered, she steadied herself with the knowledge that she was not standing alone. Every word she spoke carried the weight of communities too often erased. Every argument she made echoed the lives of those who depended on her strength. And yet, even as she rose, she was constantly underestimated. Political insiders dismissed her as too raw, too fiery, too unwilling to play by the unspoken rules of decorum. They mistook her empathy for softness, her boldness for recklessness, her refusal to bow for inexperience. Time and again, they tried to write her off. But Jasmine Crockett had no interest in playing the role others scripted for her. She wrote her own story, and in that story, compromise did not mean silence. She carried herself with dignity, but never the kind that bent beneath pressure. Her intelligence was not abstract, it was lived, forged in the trenches of real struggle. Her humanity was not polished for cameras, it was raw, visible in the way she listened to people's pain, and then turned that pain into fire. That combination, empathy and fierceness, compassion and steel, made her dangerous to those invested in keeping things as they were. Because Crockett did not merely speak for the unheard, she spoke with them. She embodied their frustration, their resilience, their refusal to be invisible. By the time she entered national politics, she had already proven that her voice could not be dismissed. Every debate, every speech, carried the rhythm of someone who knew what silence cost, and who had promised never to let it win. That is why, when she entered that courtroom, she was not simply another figure on the floor. She was a force shaped by sacrifice, by struggle, by years of standing tall in places designed to make her shrink. And perhaps most importantly, she was deeply human. Not a caricature, not a saint, not an untouchable hero, but a woman who had stumbled, learned, endured, and kept going. Her laughter carried warmth. Her anger carried purpose. Her determination carried the echo of countless voices behind her. It was precisely that humanity that made her so dangerous to the brittle arrogance of institutional power, because she did not need a robe, or a gavel, or marble pillars to command attention. She carried authority within herself, born not of status, but of truth. And when truth stands before power, power trembles. On that day, when Justice Sotomayor leaned forward and tried to silence her, the establishment believed it was putting her in her place. But Crockett had no place but forward. She had spent her life walking through doors others tried to close, speaking words others tried to cut off, embodying dignity where others expected submission. Moments like this were exactly what she had been preparing for. Moments when being underestimated turned into an advantage, when her calm fierceness shattered assumptions, when her refusal to bow forced the powerful to confront their own fragility. And so the stage was set, one woman draped in centuries of institutional authority, the other carrying the weight of lived struggle and truth. Two figures seemingly unequal, about to clash in a way that would echo far beyond the walls of a courtroom. And when these two worlds collided, the establishment, judge and the fiery congresswoman, the sparks, lit up more than a courtroom. The silence after Sotomayor's first interruption lingered like smoke in the air, but it did not last long. The justice leaned forward again, her tone sharpened, her command even more clipped. "Congresswoman, you will confine yourself to the matter at hand." The words, wrapped in judicial finality, were meant to close the door entirely. But Jasmine Crockett did not yield. At first she met the interruption with measured calm, her voice even, her posture unshaken. She acknowledged the gavel's authority but did not retreat from her point. The audience could feel her restraint, like a coiled spring refusing to snap. It was the kind of composure that only comes from years of being underestimated, years of knowing that dignity itself can be the sharpest blade. Yet Sotomayor was not finished. Again and again she cut across Crockett's sentences, narrowing her words, trying to box her in. Each time the justice spoke, the interruptions landed heavier, more impatient, more desperate to reassert control. And each time Crockett answered not with silence, but with insistence. Her voice began to sharpen, not with disrespect, but with the precision of someone refusing to be erased. She pushed back gently at first, layering her argument with facts, her cadence steady, her tone respectful but unyielding. It was the verbal equivalent of planting her feet. The gallery could feel the escalation. For every syllable Crockett spoke, another interruption fell, and for every interruption, another wave of outrage rippled through the room. Spectators shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging glances as if to say, "Why won't they let her finish?" What began as an interruption was now a pattern, an effort to control, to silence, to diminish. But Crockett would not allow it. Her calm began to glow into fire. Her responses grew sharper, her phrasing more direct, her pauses deliberate. Each word carried weight, slicing through the justice's attempts to corral her. Her tone announced what her posture confirmed. "I will not be silenced." Meanwhile, Sotomayor's veneer of composure began to falter. The clipped authority no longer sounded like order, it sounded like defensiveness. Each interruption revealed not strength, but a mounting unease. The more Crockett refused to bow, the more brittle the justice appeared. Authority was slipping, not from the robe itself, but from the confidence behind it. This was no longer a debate about procedure. It was a struggle over legitimacy. Who had the right to speak with authority? Who had the right to define truth in that chamber? The robe demanded deference, but the voice, the unflinching voice of Jasmine Crockett, demanded justice, and the audience felt the shift. Outrage built with every attempted silencing, admiration swelled with every defiant word. What had begun as a routine exercise of authority now looked like an abuse of it, and what had begun as a single congresswoman's argument now looked like a battle for every person who had ever been cut short. Crockett's words pierced through the noise, rising above interruption like a bell that cannot be unheard. She was calm when she needed to be, sharp when she had to be, and unbroken throughout. Each sentence she managed to complete felt like a triumph. Each pause after interruption, a reminder that she was still standing. And then came the moment. The interruptions had piled too high. The tension stretched too thin. The justice rattled, spoke again, her command even harsher, even more final. But this time Crockett did not pause, did not fold, did not wait for permission. She spoke with the clarity of someone who knew that silence was no longer an option. And then, in one breathtaking moment, Jasmine Crockett unleashed the words that no one in that chamber will ever forget. The tension in the chamber had become unbearable. Every set of eyes on the bench, in the gallery behind the cameras, was fixed on Jasmine Crockett. She stood there, caught between interruption and persistence, her words repeatedly sliced short. And yet she had not broken. She had not yielded. Instead, she paused. It was a pause so deliberate that it felt choreographed by destiny itself. Crockett let the silence hang. She looked to her left, then to her right, then up toward the bench where Sotomayor sat, cloaked in her robe, authority draped like armor. That pause was not hesitation, it was gathering. Gathering the air in her lungs, gathering the weight of history, gathering the courage of every silenced voice that had led her to this very moment. The room shifted. Spectators leaned in, their anticipation thick in the air. A few justices adjusted their posture, sensing something was about to break. Sotomayor, perhaps realizing she had overplayed her hand, pulled back slightly in her chair. But the steel in her eyes remained, determined to hold her ground. Crockett's gaze swept the chamber once more, and then she spoke. Her voice was calmer than it had been throughout the exchange. It carried not the sharpness of defiance, but the gravity of undeniable truth. With all due respect, Justice, my words are not a disruption. They are the reality you would rather not confront. The sentence landed like a tremor. Gasps fluttered across the gallery. One man's jaw visibly dropped. A woman in the second row pressed her hand to her mouth. Even the reporters, trained to remain neutral, scribbled faster, as though the ink itself might capture the electricity of what had just been said. Crockett continued, her tone unwavering. You can cut me off, you can shorten my sentences, but you cannot erase the truth I carry, because what I am saying does not begin with me, and it does not end with me. It belongs to the people who sent me here, the ones whose lives you do not live, whose struggles you do not feel, whose voices you cannot silence, no matter how many times you strike the gavel. Every word rang louder than the last, though her volume never rose. It was not shouting. It was resonance, the resonance of authenticity. She did not need to raise her tone because the truth itself did the heavy lifting. The justices exchanged uneasy glances. One shifted in their chair, another looked down as if to avoid the weight of her gaze. And Sotomayor, once the immovable force, leaned back ever so slightly, her lips pressed tight. Authority had not disappeared, but it had been cracked. The robe no longer looked invincible. It looked like a shield trying desperately to hold. Crockett pressed forward. The law is meant to be the protector of dignity. Yet too often it becomes the instrument of dismissal. I will not let my voice, or the voices of those who look like me, those who fight like me, be dismissed today. Not by you. Not by anyone. This time, there was no interruption. Sotomayor sat frozen. For the first time in the exchange, the silence belonged not to the justice, but to Crockett. She had taken the courtroom's air and turned it into her own. And then, the line that would echo beyond those walls, you can silence a microphone, but you cannot silence a movement. The chamber erupted not in cheers, for protocol forbade it, but in energy that vibrated through every heart. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated by the invisible roar of millions who would later see that moment replayed on screens across the nation. Gasps gave way to stunned quiet. Pens stopped scratching. Even the court stenographer paused for a beat, as if caught in the gravity of the words before remembering to resume. Sotomayor's hands, once folded firmly, now fidgeted against one another. Her eyes darted briefly toward the other justices, searching for solidarity but found none. The balance of power in that room had shifted. Authority no longer sat entirely on the bench it radiated from the woman standing below it. Crockett, sensing the silence, allowed it to linger. She did not gloat. She did not smirk. She let the words breathe, let them travel, let them embed themselves into every mind present. Her composure was her victory. Her dignity was her shield, and the audience felt it. The hero had spoken, not with arrogance but with clarity, not with hostility, but with the unshakable confidence of someone who knew that truth cannot be contained. For Sotomayor, the robe that had once conferred unquestioned dominance now seemed almost heavy, its symbolism undercut by the fragility of interruption. She shifted in her seat again, the faintest sign of unease visible to the room. She had tried to muzzle, and in doing so, had given Crockett the stage upon which to deliver her most devastating rebuttal. The chamber belonged to Crockett now. Every eye followed her, every ear hung on her pauses, every heart absorbed the courage she radiated. She had turned what should have been a silencing into a spotlight, what should have been a muzzle into a microphone louder than any gavel. And then, just as deliberately as she had begun, she ended her statement. Her final words were measured, delivered with the same calm that had carried her through. "I came here to speak truth, and I will leave knowing that truth has been spoken." The silence that followed was unlike the one at the beginning. This was not stunned confusion. This was reverence, the silence that only follows something unforgettable. Sotomayor, rattled, adjusted her robe once more. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The courtroom had witnessed the shift the underdog had spoken with such clarity, such courage, that the authority of the bench itself seemed diminished. Jasmine Crockett had not only survived the attempt to silence her, she had turned it into a mic drop moment that would be replayed, quoted, and celebrated for years to come. But if the courtroom was stunned, the reaction outside those walls would set the entire country ablaze. The moment the gavel struck and the chamber emptied, the real battlefront shifted not in marble halls, but in the digital square where millions gather by the second. Within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's rebuttal was circulating on every platform. It spread like wildfire. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook screens glowed with the image of her standing tall, her words echoing across captions, hashtags, and memes. The hashtag, "You Cannot Silence Truth," shot to the top of trending lists. Users replayed the 30-second clip over and over, marveling at the poise with which she had faced down one of the most powerful figures in the nation. A freeze frame of Crockett's calm stare, her chin lifted with quiet defiance, became the internet's new emblem of courage. Memes sprouted overnight. Sotomayor mid-interruption paired with Crockett's mic drop line. "You can silence a microphone, but you cannot silence a movement." The pairing went viral, transforming into digital graffiti plastered across timelines. Commentators pounced. Cable news anchors replayed the exchange in slow motion, dissecting every pause, every glance. Progressive outlets framed it as the moment when dignity triumphed over arrogance. Conservative voices fumbled, torn between downplaying Crockett's words and acknowledging the firestorm they had ignited. Political analysts described it as one of those rare instances when rhetoric crosses into history. Celebrities joined the chorus. Musicians, actors, and cultural figures shared the clip with captions like, "This is how you face power," and "Spoken like every one of us who has ever been cut off." A-list names reshared her words, giving them new reach. Soon, even international voices were weighing in, with headlines abroad marveling at the congresswoman who had stopped a courtroom cold. But the most powerful reactions didn't come from elites. They came from ordinary people. Across the country, citizens recorded videos of themselves reacting to the moment. Immigrant mothers spoke into their phones about how they saw their daughters in Crockett's defiance. Young activists wept on camera, describing the validation they felt watching someone refuse to be silenced. Workers on their lunch breaks posted shaky cell phone recordings of themselves, replaying the clip in awe, whispering, "That's my voice right there." One viral TikTok showed a classroom of college students erupting in cheers as their professor paused a lecture to show them Crockett's words. Another video captured a family gathered around a television, a grandmother nodding through tears as she whispered, "She spoke for us." These were not orchestrated moments. They were organic, raw, and profoundly human. The ripple effect was undeniable. Local organizers used the moment as a rallying cry for meetings and marches. Activists plastered Crockett's words on signs, shirts, and murals. Churches repeated her line in sermons. Teachers quoted it in classrooms. It was no longer just a courtroom exchange. It had become a cultural landmark, a shorthand for courage in the face of power. The narrative crystallized quickly. Jasmine Crockett had not simply stood her ground. She had given language to millions who had felt the sting of being silenced. She turned private frustration into public empowerment. What Sotomayor had intended as a command for silence became, through Crockett, a megaphone for truth. It wasn't just a moment. It became a movement, and the numbers reflected it. In the span of 24 hours, Crockett's name trended worldwide. Her follower count soared. Fundraising emails sent out by her team shattered records. Her words were played on repeat at rallies she wasn't even present for. The soundbite became the anthem of a political season, echoing through podcasts, newsrooms, and dinner tables alike. But amid the celebration and noise, something deeper pulsed. Beneath the memes and hashtags, there was a lesson, a truth about courage, dignity, and the fragility of power when confronted by authenticity. And yet, beyond the noise of trending hashtags, the deeper lesson of this clash still burned bright. In the days that followed, as the clips replayed endlessly and the hashtags continued their meteoric climb, Jasmine Crockett stepped back to reframe the moment. To her, it had never been about a single exchange, a single justice, or even a single courtroom. It was about something larger, something every viewer, every citizen, every silenced soul could recognize. She reminded the country that dignity will always outweigh arrogance. That truth, even when sliced apart, interrupted, and dismissed, carries a power that cannot be extinguished. In her speeches and interviews afterward, she made no effort to gloat. Instead, she turned the spotlight outward, toward the people who had seen themselves in her defiance. "This was never about me," she said with calm conviction. "It was about everyone who has ever been told to stop talking. Everyone who has been cut off mid-sentence, made to feel small, made to feel their truth was inconvenient. What happened in that courtroom was for them." Her words struck at something deep, because whether in boardrooms, classrooms, or dinner tables, people knew the sting of interruption. They knew what it felt like to be dismissed. And now, watching Crockett stand tall under the shadow of a Supreme Court justice, they felt their own voices validated. Her moment became their mirror. She reframed the attack not as a humiliation, but as a revelation. Suppression only proves the importance of the truth it tries to bury. Arrogance only exposes its own weakness when confronted by calm dignity. Authority may have robes and gavels, but courage wears no costume, and still it shines brighter. This was not about one courtroom. It was about the universal struggle for recognition. It was about the immigrant worker told to just be grateful when raising concerns. The young student ignored in classrooms where their questions were dismissed. The parent dismissed at town halls when asking for basic respect. Crockett stood for them all, her composure whispering across communities, "You are not alone." And so the inspirational crescendo swelled. Her victory was not measured in one-liners or trending hashtags, but in the reflection it stirred. People began to ask themselves what it meant to be American, not in the narrow sense of authority and order, but in the broader, richer truth of democracy, that every voice matters. That justice, at its core, is not marble walls and gavels, but the willingness to hear the unheard. Crockett, through her defiance, embodied service, not service to ego, but service to dignity itself. She reminded the country that leadership is not about silencing, but about amplifying. That Americanness is not about pedigree, but about courage. Her words, delivered with such composure, carried the reminder that this nation's promise is unfinished, but every act of refusal to bow brings it closer to fulfillment. The people who watched her saw not just a congresswoman, they saw possibility. They saw the strength of speaking truth even in the face of overwhelming power. They saw themselves, not diminished, but elevated, and as the noise of pundits and critics continued, her message lingered deeper than the chatter. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. Truth will always pierce suppression. Courage will always unsettle the fragile foundations of unchecked power. Her reply had stopped the courtroom cold, but more importantly, it had warmed millions of hearts with renewed faith that justice, real justice, is still possible when someone dares to stand unshaken. And as the echoes of that moment continue to ripple, one truth remains unshakable. Justice tried to muzzle her, but her reply stopped everything cold. In a single exchange, Jasmine Crockett reminded the nation that truth, spoken with dignity, can silence even the most powerful attempts to suppress it. What began as a clash inside a courtroom became a story retold in homes, classrooms, and communities across the country, a reminder that arrogance crumbles when faced with unwavering courage. The moral clarity of that moment could not be ignored. It was not simply a congresswoman defying a justice. It was the eternal struggle between suppression and expression, between arrogance and dignity, between the brittle weight of power and the unshakable force of truth. And when history records this chapter, it will not remember the interruptions. It will remember the voice that refused to be silenced. But this story does not end here. It is not confined to that chamber or that day. It belongs to every person who has ever been cut short, every community dismissed, every truth denied. And the movement that followed online, in the streets, in the hearts of ordinary people, proves that the fight for dignity is not over. It is just beginning. So if you believe in voices that cannot be silenced, if you believe in the power of truth to outlast arrogance, then join us. Subscribe, share, and become part of this growing chorus. Because every click, every repost, every conversation keeps the flame alive. Let this moment be more than something you watched. Let it be something you carried forward. Because the truth is clear, when dignity stands tall, it cannot be muzzled. And when we stand together, no courtroom, no robe, no gavel can stop us cold.